These political organizations were primarily concerned with spreading socialist ideas, including those of anarchism and syndicalism, amongst the urban working class, and establishing syndicalist trade unions with the objective of overthrowing capitalism through a general strike and lockout of the capitalist class. In many cases, they had a specific focus towards organizing the African working class, believing that by organizing one big union, which would, quote, overcome the bounds of craft and race and sex, end quote, both class and national oppression could be destroyed through the overthrow of capitalism and the state. Amongst these unions were the Indian Industrial Workers Union, formed in Durban in 1917, the Horse Drivers Union, and the Clothing Workers Industrial Union, both founded in Johannesburg in 1919, the Sweet and Jam Workers Industrial Union from Cape Town, 1918, and the Industrial Workers of Africa, or the IWA, which, modeled on the IWW, was the first union for African workers in South Africa, and possibly in all of England's African empire. Militants from the IWA's all-African executives, such as Reuben Etiwe and Hamilton Kraai, were also active in the National Liberation Movement, such as in the Transvaal Native Congress, a provincial branch of the precursor to the modern-day African National Congress, or the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa. They established a pro-labor bloc, which between 1918 and 1920 pushed the party towards the left and towards popular mobilization instead of petitioning the Crown, which was its MO before that. It's the precursor to the African National Congress, the SA, South African National Native Congress, was formed in 1912. In June 1918, when workers protested the detention of 152 striking African municipal workers, IWA militants called for a general strike to take place in 10 days time. The strike was called off at the last minute, however, but thousands of mine workers still came out, having not received the news, and clashed with the police. Amongst 8 activists later arrested and tried for incitement to public violence in the country's first ever multiracial political trial were 3 ISL and 3 IWA militants and 2 from the left wing of the Transvaal Native Congress. The state's case fell apart when a police spy retracted his testimony that the arrested syndicalists had orchestrated the mine strike. By the early 1920s, syndicalism and militant trade unionism was in decline, in part due to the brutal state repression of the 1913 and 1914 general strikes, and, importantly, the 1922 white mine workers strike. The strike was put down by the Air Force. The syndicalist Percy Fisher and his associate Spendif holed up in the headquarters of the Council of Action in a gun battle with the police, used their last rounds to kill themselves. The strike was by white mine workers who feared being replaced by cheap African labor. But the Council of Action had tried to give the strike a non-racial character and bring black workers out on strike as well. Now when we look at parallels and differences contributing to the development and loss of the social vector in both South Africa and Brazil. As we have seen then, there are a number of significant, even uncanny parallels between the emergence and development of the libertarian socialist movements, most articulated by syndicalism in both South Africa and Brazil. The role of migration, industrialization and urbanization, and a common third world or colonial/post-colonial experience were all important factors in contributing to the arrival of the idea and its rapid development. The peaks in both South Africa and Brazil coincided with the global peak, the glory years of 1917 to 1920. Or at least during the glory years of 1917 to 1920, at a time that presented a period of massive hope for anarchism and working class liberation throughout the world, including but not limited to the Russian Revolution of the same time period. But there were also serious differences. Race dynamics were very different, for example. In South Africa, most white workers were free wage laborers with political rights, while black workers tended to be coerced and unfree. Just put into context that there's a difference between African and black in a South African context. By black, we refer to all non-white, and in this circumstance, workers. Included there would be colored or mixed race workers, Indian workers, and African workers. When we have referred to African previously, we are specifically referring to black African workers, and not necessarily the other two categories, which we would include in the black category. Whereas in Brazil, white immigrant workers, often from countries like Italy and Spain, were very often extremely exploited, experiencing a lower social status than that of freed slaves and their descendants. These racial dynamics contributed to the development of different forms of nationalisms. In South Africa, many white workers promoted a model of white laborism, calling for job color bars to defend their privilege and protect themselves from being replaced by cheaper black labor. This and the different influences of conservative, reformist, racially exclusive and elitist African, Indian and colored nationalisms, of course, also led to a greatly divided working class. The conservative African nationalism was the origin of the ANC. One of the effects is that the syndicalist movement in South Africa was never built up to be quite as large and influential as it was in Brazil. The syndicalist unions, despite their important role, remaining minority unions even at the movement's peak. These different influences also played out in the way the movements were able to respond to and withstand what the FARJ defines as the two contexts of crisis, culminating in the loss of the social vector of anarchism. One of the situation, and the other of anarchism itself. In both Brazil and South Africa, as part of a general crackdown on the workers' movement and the left in general, in response to these waves of strikes and social upheavals between the 1910s and 20s, many anarchist and syndicalist organizers were deported. In addition to state repression, the crisis of the situation was also characterized by the corporatist harnessing of the unions to the state under the influence of different forms of nationalist developmentalism, although in South Africa it was only white unions that allied to the state, following the rise of a racist developmental state after 1924. Also of particular significance in both cases is the influence of Bolshevism and the impact of news of the Russian Revolution abroad, or at least the news that was getting through or allowed to get through, and how the syndicalist organizations responded to the challenges of Bolshevism. The second factor in the two contexts of crisis to which the FARJ refers, the crisis of anarchism itself, to which they partly attribute the loss of the social vector, was marked primarily by the confusion between different levels of action. For many militants, unionism, which was the medium of action that should lead to the social revolution, ended by becoming the end itself. On one side, a part of the anarchists defended the need for specifically anarchist organization, which would seek social insertion in the unions. On the other, anarchists who had understood militancy within the unions as their only task, and thus forgot to form specific groups capable of giving support to the revolutionary practice. The FARJ goes on to say that, quote again, the lack of anarchist organizations that could lend support to the class struggle, expressed most notably at the time by the unions, this is also largely responsible for the loss of the social vector of anarchism. As the ideological organizations were not sedimented, the context of the crisis of syndicalism eventually extended to anarchism itself. Thus, a crisis at the social level also condemned at the political level, since there was no real difference between the two at the time. Once the social vector is lost, and without specific organizations capable of sustaining an ideological struggle of longer duration, it was not possible for the anarchists to immediately find another space for insertion. Thus, the crisis in revolutionary syndicalism took also the social vector of the anarchists, who then started to organize themselves into cultural groups and for the preservation of memory. These quotes come directly from the document Anarchism in Brazil, Loss and Attempt to Recapture the Social Vector, which is in Social Anarchism and Organization, a FARJ document.